Since 1980, there have been 154 documented serial killers in the world. 56% of those are or were American citizens. There are 35 active serial killers in the U.S. at any given time. The average IQ of a serial killer is 94.7. Compared to the world average, it is in the normal range. 70% of mass murderers experienced an extensive head injury as children. 60% of these killers also wet their beds as adolescents. Only 15% of the victims of serial killers are random. In other words, if you are a victim of a serial murderer, there is an 85% chance that you will know them. Demographics of American serial killers. White men account for 52.21% of serial murderers. The other 40% are African American and 6% Hispanic. An astounding 90.8% of these killers are males and only 21% have a military background. Statistics on victims. White Americans are the most common serial killer victims at 68%, while African Americans are at 24%. Gender-wise, men are slightly more likely to become victims at 54% versus 46% for women. Heriberto Serra was the Zodiac Killer of New York City. He was born on July 31st, 1967 in New York City. He was very religious, unemployed, and unmarried. He also did not have many friends growing up. At the age of 16, he dropped out of high school when he was caught carrying a weapon to school. He was also known to mentally and physically abuse his sister until the time of his capture. He was an extremely religious man, so it is doubtful that drugs or alcohol were involved in his crimes. No, he did not have a family history of mental illness. He was not married at the time of his capture or have any children. He had 8 victims, 5 of which survived. His only criteria for the victims were based off of a sense of evil and duty to God, as well as their horoscopes. His method of killing was shooting them from behind with a modified, usually ineffective gun. His 8 victims were Mario Ozorco, Herman Montenegro, Joe Proce, Larry Parham, Patricia Fonte, Jim Weber, Joseph Diacone, and Diane Ballard. In total, he was sentenced to 236 years in prison. The forensic evidence used to apprehend him and sentence him was undeniable. After shooting his sister, his handwritten statement was signed with the same symbol as the New York City Zodiac Killer, which sparked the investigation. Despite his claim that he could never be linked to the crimes due to his lack of rifling on the improvised guns he used, police were still able to use the toolmark evidence to link Serra to the attacks. Also, fingerprint evidence was found at the scenes of the crimes, and handwritten analysis determined a strong similarity between Serra's statement and the anonymous letters. Most damning, police found Serra's DNA on one of the stamps that had been used to mail the letter to the police. Serra was diagnosed as a schizophrenic and mentally ill, but not enough to plead the insanity card. Legally, to be deemed insane, the defendant must not know the difference between right and wrong. Serra's entire crusade was based off of rights and wrongs, therefore he was not legally insane. Treatment-wise, it is hard to predict whether treatment would have changed Serra's actions, but it is known that he had tried multiple times to contact his sister, who he had abused for years, which is a sign that he most likely received treatment in jail. I would recommend cognitive therapy since cognitive therapists believe it is dysfunctional thinking that leads to dysfunctional emotions or behaviors. By changing their thoughts, people can change how they feel and what they do.
Jeffrey Dahmer is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had a rough childhood growing up because his parents were always fighting. Before the age of 10, Jeffrey was molested by another boy in the neighborhood. Many people think that this played a huge role in him becoming so mentally ill as an adult. He demonstrated one of the traits of the McDonald triad because he liked to kill and torture his animals. He killed and buried his first victim in his backyard when he was 19. After that, Jeffrey went on a killing spree, raping and torturing preferably black men. Dahmer described as a thrill-seeking type of serial killer. He killed 16 more people before getting caught in the time span from 1978 to 1991. One of his victims had escaped Dahmer's apartment and was seen running on the street by police in handcuffs, bleeding and beaten. The police went to Dahmer's apartment and found all of the remains of his previous victims. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences in a Milwaukee court in Wisconsin with parole. He later was killed by an inmate after serving 3 years in 1994 in prison. The inmate claimed that Dahmer would taunt other inmates with chicken bones and brag about his killings in prison.
Gary Leon Ridgway is a serial killer from Washington, which is the western region of the United States. He is also known as the Green River Killer. He was born in Salt Lake City on February 18, 1949. When Gary was young, he was poor in school, and he was also abused mentally and physically by his mother, whose name is Mary Rita Ridgway. His dad was also abusive towards Gary and his 2 other brothers. In Gary's childhood, he also tortured animals. Ridgway was first married to Claudia Barrows, but after a year, they got divorced because they had affairs. His second wife's name was Mauricia Winslow, and they had a son together named Matthew. The two separated, but Gary was able to keep his son. Gary's crimes were in Washington, and he normally dumped the victims' bodies near the Green River. This is how Gary Ridgway got the nickname the Green River Killer. There were at least 49 people killed by Gary Ridgway. He was always going for prostitutes because he believed that he could kill many of them without getting caught. He thought this because people would not file a missing persons report right away for a prostitute. The prostitutes were between the ages of 12 to 31. He would be classified as an organized and lust serial killer. He is organized because he always has the plan to dump the body right near the Green River. He's classified as a lust serial killer because sex is the primary motive for a lust killer, and he always raped his victims before he killed them. There was one survivor that Gary Ridgway had. Her name was Rebecca. She is also a prostitute, and Gary picked her up one day when she was getting off of work. She offered him sex in exchange for $20, and eventually Gary tried to strangle her from behind, but luckily enough she was able to get away, and she ran to help nearby. Gary was arrested on November 30th, 2001, and he was sentenced to 48 consecutive prison sentences. Ridgway has no hope of getting parole, and he avoided the death penalty by only agreeing to help locate all the other missing bodies.
The DC sniper's legal name was Sean Allen Muhammad. John was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on December 31st, 1960. John was raised by his aunt and his grandpa because his mother passed away from breast cancer and his father left him when he was 3 years old. He was abused by many of his relatives during his childhood. John did not use any sort of drugs, and he was not alcoholic. John also did not have any sort of psychological history or treatment. John was married to Carol Kegler after he graduated from high school, but around 1985 he left her and married Mildred Green after he was stationed at Washington State when he was with the Army. But in around 1999, Mildred filed for divorce, and she got a restraining order on John because of the threats he was making against her. Shortly after the restraining order, John kidnapped his 3 kids, and he ran away. That's where he would later find his partner in the shootings, Lee Boyd Malvo. The police found him and returned the 3 kids to Mildred, and furious by the separation from his kids, John began to fixate on Malvo, treating him as if he was his son. The locations of the preliminary shootings were in Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and Washington. The locations of the DC sniper attacks were in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. All these crimes were committed between February 16, 2002 and October 24, 2002. John and Malvo killed a total of 17 people, and all of the shootings that they did were organized. John was a gang type of serial killer, and he did not keep any sort of trophies. A total of 10 victims survived the shootings and later helped the police find out where John and Malvo are. John and Malvo were found sleeping in their 1990 Chevrolet Caprice at a rest stop. They were arrested around 3:15 a.m. on October 24, 2002. John was punished by death, and he died by lethal injection. The police discovered Malvo's fingerprints at a shooting that happened in Montgomery, Alabama, and after further investigation, the police discovered Malvo had close ties with John, and that's where they would later find out where John and Malvo were hiding.